Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today gonna look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I should really prep more for these episodes. We're looking at 5 people today who experienced some karma. Again, I should probably prepare a little bit more for these episodes. I don't. I prepared for these episodes back when I wrote the books that these stories are in, and then I haven't really looked at them since. This is why this podcast is never going to go anywhere. Production quality, fine-ish, all right? I don't sound like I'm recording in a bathroom or anything. I mean, there's the occasional background noise, but that's whatever. No one cares about that. But the actual show prep is leaving a lot to be desired. All right. Because here's the thing. Here's how I do this. This is my process. All right. You may know that I write all of these books that no one reads, but I write all these books, these 100 stories series, and there's 100 stories in them. And I do a lot of research to get those stories picked out and written and added into those books. And then what I do, what I've at least started to do now, is when I'm done with those books, I have a large spreadsheet, because I'm autistic, of all of the stories that I've ever written about. And I will go through and I will find, oh, this one will make a good episode, or, oh, these are all kind of a similar topic, and I will put them all in. And so like, that's what I did with this one. And I was like, oh, all these people had karma. And that's how this episode, and I put all 5 of those people into this episode, and it's been a while since I read about these stories. I don't remember how any of them go. So you and me are along for the same journey today. We're gonna find out what happened together. So we're looking at the stories of Ken McIlroy, Grace Olive Wiley, Kay Grayson, Peter Reyn-Bardt, and our first story will be of William Burke. Story time. I'm like kind of disappointed in myself, but also I'm not. Who cares, right? Like, this isn't NPR. You're not coming here for the highest, most sophisticated storytelling. You're here to escape from the reality that is the dumpster fire happening around you. And so here we go. All right, William Burke. We're going to learn about this guy together because I don't remember who he is. William Burke was born in 1792 in Ireland to middle-class parents who provided him with a generally comfortable life. All right. So this is not like a lot of our other stories where this kid had a terrible childhood. His parents were terrible people. Like, he was totally fine. After briefly serving in the military, Burke got married and settled in County Mayo on the western side of Ireland. However, he quickly deserted his new family in 1818 after he and his father-in-law got into an argument over land ownership, which I guess, probably happened a lot in the early 1800s, because what else are you going to argue about? After that, Burke moved to Scotland and got a job working on the Union Canal. And when the canal was finished, Burke and the woman that he had since recently met and married moved to Edinburgh, where they hawked secondhand clothes to the poor. Despite this low-paying job, Burke gained a reputation as a hard worker with a good sense of humor who was rarely seen without his Bible in hand. So in 1827, Burke and his wife then traveled to Midlothian to work the harvest. And while there, they met a man named William Hare, who owned a boarding house back in Edinburgh. Burke and Hare quickly became friends before moving into Hare's boarding house in Edinburgh to continue working. Well, on November 29th, 1827, a man staying at this boarding house died of dropsy, which is like extreme swelling of something, and I don't know why. The man left behind a 4-pound rent bill, which in 1827 money was apparently a lot. And while Hare figured he would never recoup that money, Burke instead thought it would be perfectly fine to sell this man's dead body to a local anatomist to study and dissect. The problem was that Hare had already arranged for the body to be taken to a local church for burial. Burke, however, small obstacle, but he didn't think this was a very big deal. So Instead, he filled the coffin that had just arrived for the man with bark from a nearby tanner and sealed it up. And no one else was going to open the coffin. Like, it wasn't going to be an open casket or anything. He just throws a bunch of wood in there, gets it to about the similar weight of what this guy would have been, and sends the coffin off. The man then went over, both Williams went over to Dr. Robert Knox's offices, where they were paid almost £8 for the body. So they've doubled, they've made back their money, and then they also got 100% of the bill. Basically, you get it. As they left, one of Dr. Knox's assistants remarked that they would be happy to buy another body when they had one, and the plot to this little dark comedy was born. So, over the next year, Burke and Hare would get drunk and murder 16 guests at random, staying at Hare's boarding house. Although some were sick when they arrived, most of the victims were completely healthy. Burke and Hare would then get them just drunk enough to pass out before smothering them to death and then taking the warm bodies to Dr. Knox, who happily paid between £8 and £10 for each person. On one occasion, Burke murdered a grandmother and then lured her mute grandson into the room where they killed him in front of her corpse. Oh, man, that is like one of those dark comedy scenes, right? Like, you got the old timey music playing in the background, and these two dudes just get done killing this old lady. And then they go out and find her mute grandson, who's not going to make any noise anyway. And then they show her his dead grandmother's body before killing him too. It's fantastic. On October 31st, 1828, Burke lured Margaret Docherty Margaret into the boarding house by claiming that the two were distant relatives with each other. And then, as planned, Burke and Hare murdered this woman after she was too drunk to realize what was going on and temporarily stuffed her body in a pile of straw at the end of a bed while they figured out how to transport her to Dr. Knox. However, the next day, a pair of nosy tenants at the boarding house, Anne and James Gray, grew suspicious after Burke refused to let them near that particular bed where they had stuffed this dead woman's body. Well, when this couple were finally left alone, the Grays started snooping around. They started searching the bed, and they found Margaret's body. So on the way to alert police, the Grays ran into Burke's wife, who was also in on all of this murder. She knew what was going on. Burke's wife then tried to bribe this couple with £10 per week to stay quiet, but the Grays refused. Although Burke and Hare had already taken the body to Knox by the time police had arrived, they couldn't get their stories straight, and police arrested them and took them in for questioning. Burke, Hare, and their wives were arrested on November 3rd, even though police weren't completely sure if murder was involved or how many other bodies were missing. The trial began on Christmas Eve and went nonstop through the entire day. Early the next morning, on Christmas morning, which is crazy that they have court on Christmas morning, but it's the early 1800s, Burke was convicted of murdering Margaret Docherty while the others ended up being let go. Rather than a standard death sentence, though, Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle sentenced Burke to be dissected upon his death. Karma. There it is. There's the theme. We found it. Right? Like, Burke is murdering all of these people. He's sending them to this doctor who is dissecting them and studying the bodies. And the judge is like, you will die the same way. He was hanged on January 28th, 1829, in front of as many as 25,000 people who, thanks to sensationalized media reports, had become super invested and enraged by this story. Burke's corpse was publicly dissected a couple of days later on February 1st, which is wild, right? Like, it's wild that 25,000 people would just show up to watch a dude get hanged, which we've seen happen a lot. But then to publicly dissect a human body, that's nuts. But also, again, we're talking about like my master plan here of pay-per-view executions, right? Eliminate the national debt. Let's also pay-per-view human dissection. Let's do it. Again, you can bundle, right? Probably $500 to watch the execution, another $250 to watch the human dissection of the body afterwards. But then if you want to bundle it, right, you can get both for $625, right? Knock half off of that dissection. I don't know. Seems. Look, I need to pitch this to somebody. All right. Maybe if Trump gets reelected, I'll pitch this to him. He seems like he would go for this. All right. He seems like the perfect guy to pitch this to. God, that'd be so great. Anyway, during Burke's dissection, a small riot broke out after a larger than expected crowd had gathered to see this ironic event. Once order had been restored, groups in batches of 50 were allowed to pass through the theater to see the body once the dissection had finished. Again, crazy, because now, like, Burke's body is just in all of these pieces, hollowed out, and people are just walking by like, oh, yeah, there it is, there it is. I don't know what accent that is. I was trying to do Scotland, and I couldn't find it, and I just Swedish chefed my way through it. Anyway, during the procedure of the dissection, the performing doctor, Professor Alexander Monroe, dipped a quill pen into Burke's head and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged in Edinburgh. The blood was taken from his head." Following the dissection, Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of the Edinburgh Medical School. A book was also bound with his tanned skin, which is disgusting. Moving on here to Grace Olive Wiley, who was born in Chanute, Kansas in 1883. She initially began her career studying insects, but while working in the desert for the University of Kansas, Grace fell in love with rattlesnakes and devoted the rest of her life to studying them. So we can already see where this story's gonna go. Let's find out how we get there. In just a few years, she became the first person to successfully breed rattlesnakes in captivity, mainly because so few people had been dumb enough to try that before. Like it's like the first statement seems like she has made this amazing, incredible scientific breakthrough that no one's ever been able to do before. But the only reason she was able to do it is because no one really cared or was dumb enough to try it before. Marketing. So, after becoming a curator at the Minneapolis Public Library in 1923, which at the time had a large collection of live reptiles and amphibians for some reason, like, why does a library have all of these live reptiles? It doesn't make any sense. But while she's there, she gains notoriety for being a fearless woman because, I mean, basically every other woman alive around this time was basically just like sewing scarves or fainting on couches. Like no other women were just handling snakes all willy-nilly, right? She even appeared in Time and Life magazines as a, quote, woman without fear, and tried to convince the public that snakes weren't scary and that our fear of them was manufactured. And snakes are scary, all right? They're very scary. All right, no other animal moves like a snake does. All other animals have legs. Snakes don't. That's crazy, all right? Then snakes can bite you, and that hurts, and they're venomous. And that's also crazy because there are some other venomous animals, like spiders, also scary. But, you know, I get it. Like, ooh, she's this super brave lady. She's super into snakes, right? She's a snake girl. You ever seen Snake Girls? Those chicks who have a pet snake and they make it their entire personality because they're edgy and dark and they snake, whatever. We see right through you. And I don't know what I'm talking about at this point. Grace was quoted as saying, "Children love snakes as naturally as they love dogs and cats," which did not cite any sources whatsoever because that is just not true. Kids are afraid of snakes 100%. She also asserted that venomous snakes were harmless as long as they were properly trained. And that was an easy thing to say coming from someone who had tamed over 300 venomous snakes, even getting so cocky as to forego using any handling instruments and just using her bare hands to just grab these things and corral them under control. She would also just let venomous snakes openly slither around her office because this woman's clearly a psychopath. She's not just a cool snake handler. This woman is crazy, all right? And guess what? Her reckless behavior with her snakes eventually led to her resignation from the library, mostly because other people were not cool with her just having snakes just out in the library around where other people could come in contact with them. She did quickly find a job, though, at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. Even more, she brought the entire library of reptiles and amphibians with her from the Minneapolis library, which is probably a good call. Unfortunately, she was fired a year later after she accidentally let 19 snakes escape from their cages. Accidentally. After losing her job, Grace moved out to California and spent the next decade as a snake trainer and a consultant for the Jungle Book and Tarzan films. On July 20th, 1948, Grace invited a journalist to visit her own personal zoo to photograph her collection of snakes. And we are finally at the moment you've been waiting for when I first started this story. As Grace posed with a highly venomous Indian cobra, the flash from the journalist's camera startled the snake, causing it to lunge at Grace and bite her. On the way out of the zoo, the only bottle of cobra anti-venom she had broke. Although she made it to the hospital in plenty of time, this hospital only carried anti-venom for American snakes because no one had the foresight to predict that someone would ever get bitten by a foreign snake, and Grace died 2 hours later. I mean, like, it's mean of me to laugh, but also, like, what'd you expect? What did you expect to happen? It's like, oh, we're all sad that Steve Irwin died, but like, sure, a stingray, we didn't have that on the bingo card, but like, we kind of all saw it coming, you know? So obviously this chick would die by a snake bite. Anyway, moving on to Ken McIlroy, who was born on June 1st, 1934. He was the 15th of 16 kids born to a poor migrant farming couple, because those are the exact types of people who keep having kids, even though they know they shouldn't. The family eventually settled in the small town of Skidmore in rural northwestern Missouri, where Ken dropped out of school after the 8th grade and basically built his reputation on raccoon hunting, cattle rustling, and just being a dick to everybody. Like, this guy, he wasn't just like the school bully, he was the town bully. Everyone hated him. He's a dick. He's always causing trouble. And for the next 2 decades, practically everyone in Skidmore suspected Ken of stealing all sorts of things important to a small Midwestern town, like antiques, alcohol, gas, grain, and livestock. He was arrested 21 different times, but avoided conviction each time, mainly because he went to great lengths to intimidate any witnesses that may have ended up testifying against him. So basically, you know, we see this a lot in serial killer cases where the victim just becomes too scared to testify. Like, that's what Ken was doing. He would get arrested, and then when he's out on bail awaiting trial, he'd go and track down the people that ratted him out, and he would just intimidate them and threaten them to the point where they would just refuse to testify and they would drop the charges. Ken also married 4 different women over those 2 decades, fathering a total of 10 children. So, real good guy. His last wife, Trina McLeod, was only 12 when they met and 14 when she got pregnant. And here's the thing, guys. Ken was way older than that. All right, this was not a good situation. But Ken, he's such a good, cool stand-up guy that he actually moved Trina in with him and his current wife, Alice, who was somehow completely fine with it. Probably because if she wasn't, Ken was going to beat the hell out of her. And because Ken was such a great guy, and he didn't want, bigamy was over the line, right? Like, he, morally speaking, he could not be married to 2 women at once. It's not right. All right. Bible says, all right. God would be very disappointed in him if he was married to more than one. He wasn't a delinquent like that. All right. So what he does is he moves his 14-year-old second wife in with him and his current wife, and then he divorces his current wife. And he did all of this mostly just to avoid the statutory rape charges. All right. Also, because bigamy was just a moral roadblock for him. But the only reason he moved, Trina in, though, was to avoid the statutory rape charges. So after Trina gave birth, she and Alice, who for some ridiculous reason still continued living with Ken and Trina after she got divorced, these two women fled to Trina's parents' house. However, Ken not only tracked them down and brought them back home, but he made a return trip to Trina's parents' house, shot their dog, and burned the house down. Like, I don't know what the parents did or said to Ken to evoke that kind of response. And maybe it was just, well, if they think they're just going to keep running away over there, I'll make sure there's no house for them to run over there to. And then just kills the dog on top. Like, this dude's just totally unhinged. He was finally arrested in June 1973 for arson and statutory rape, but was released on $2,500 bail. Trina, authorities still stepped in at this point and sent Trina and her baby to a foster family in Maryville, Missouri, 15 miles away. However, Ken easily tracked them down and spent hours standing outside the foster family's window, just staring inside. And the family saw him. It's not like they weren't aware of him. He's just out there because this dude doesn't care. What's anybody going to do to him? Arrest him? Oh, he's just going to post bond or post bail and just keep going about his life because no one's going to do anything. Ken even told this foster family that he was going to kidnap their biological daughter, and even pointed out that he knew what school she went to and what bus she rode. That is just such a ballsy thing to do. He also made a point to mention that he was happy to do a girl-for-girl trade if that's what it came down to. This dude is just, hey, man, I know where your girl goes to school. I know what bus she's on. Hey, look, here's the thing. All right. I'm clear, she's clearly my type. If you want to trade, all right, I give you Trina and the baby. Get a little 2-for-1 here. Let me see your daughter. And I will. Hey, I'll make her just like Trina. I can get her knocked up for you. Get her that there, the America there. I hate this dude. And I have no connection to this story. Although additional charges were added to Ken's extensive rap sheet, he remained free while he waited for his next trial to begin. Well, 3 years later, farmer Romaine Henry told police that Ken had shot him twice with a shotgun after he had kindly told Ken to just stop shooting weapons on his property, which that's a reasonable response, right? You just want to go out and shoot your gun, and then some fun ruiner, some old party pooper's just going to come and hey, can you not shoot your guns on my property? And Ken's like, bruh, bacow, and shoots this dude because that's how you resolve conflict. Well, because Romaine Henry had been hiding his own criminal past from authorities, Ken was acquitted from these charges and walked free again. So no one in Skidmore, Missouri is doing the right thing, apparently. In 1980, one of Ken's children got into an argument with a man named Bo Bowenkamp, a local grocery store owner. And when Ken found out, he showed up to the store with a shotgun and threatened him. Bo, however, a name like Bo Bowenkamp, he's not a guy who's just going to back down, right? He's going to stand up. And he began telling Ken everything that was wrong with him. You know what, Ken? You're a terrible person, all right? You're knocking up all these women. You're having all these kids. You're raping. You're shooting. You're just stealing everything. You're a terrible person. And Ken, he looks at Bo and he's like, you know what, Bo? You're right. I have lived a very terrible life. I need to go down to the church and I need to talk to the pastor. I need to get my life right. I need to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and I need to turn my life around. And that's not at all what he did. He shot Bo in the neck. he just did not gonna hear it. Just pulls out his gun, pow, shots Bo in the neck with a shotgun. Bo somehow survives this. I guess he just grazed him. I don't know. And immediately went to police, who charged Ken with attempted murder. However, finally, somehow, this trial actually happened. He was convicted of attempted murder, but then for some reason, the courts still let him post bail while he appealed the sentence, which seems like a very silly thing to do. And as soon as he left the courthouse following this trial, Ken went down to the local tavern armed with an M1 Garand rifle, which is the standard issue World War II weapon with a bayonet attached, which I don't know how he gets a hold of one of those. and he proclaimed to the whole town that he was going to put an end to Bowen Camp. Several people realized this was not going to end well. They appealed to authorities about what they needed to do to get rid of Ken. Not to, smooth over this whole situation. They're past that. The residents of Skidmore went to police and were like, hey, what can we do legally to get rid of Ken McIlroy? And the police were like, yeah, you can't kill him. That's also murder. And we would have to, even though we'd be happy, we'd have to arrest you for murder because that's illegal. And so the police told him like the best thing they could do legally was to perform a neighborhood why do I keep saying perform? Was to form a neighborhood watch, which, I mean, a neighborhood watch is like only slightly more effective than doing nothing at all. Like, so pointless. Well, on July 10th, 1981, after Ken's appeal hearing was delayed several times, the residents of Skidmore met at the Legion Hall with Sheriff Dan Estes to discuss what they should do once and for all. When they found out that Ken was in town and drinking in the tavern with Trina, they all rushed down to confront him. And within minutes, this bar was full of angry Skidmore residents quietly staring at Ken, watching him drink. That's like a weird scene out of a movie, right? Like, it's like this crowd, this angry mob runs in to this tavern, and there's Ken sitting at the bar drinking with his underage wife, with his teenager wife. And Ken's, I mean, what is 1981? Ken was born in 34. Dude's almost 50 years old with his teenage wife. But like, rather than like come in and start yelling at him, like this mob just quietly stands around him while Ken's just drinking his beer. And Ken doesn't care. He's just, cause he knows he's a dick. And he finishes his beer, pays his tab, which is, good for him. Bought an extra 6-pack for the ride home. Got to have your road beers. And then he walks out. Like, he just like makes his way through the crowd. And, he's just like, good. See you later, guys. And just walks back out to his pickup truck. But as he started his truck, several gunshots rang out from the crowd who had also followed him out to the parking lot. He was hit twice by 2 different guns and fell over dead in the driver's seat. Although there were 46 witnesses to this murder, including Trina, no one called an ambulance. No one actually claimed to see who the gunman was. The district attorney, upon reviewing all of the evidence, declined to press charges. And to this day, the murder of Ken McIlroy remains unsolved, and everyone is totally okay with that. Dude got what he deserved. Our next story here happened on May 13th, 1983, when commercial peat cutters Andy Mold and Stephen Dooley were watching their peat travel along a conveyor belt when they noticed a soccer ball-sized object that seemed very out of place, right? Okay, so clearly we're in Scotland. They're the peat moss. They're harvesting it because that's what they do for some reason. I don't know what it's for, but it seems important. After removing the peat that covered it, they realized they were holding an alarmingly preserved human head that still had some brain, an eye, and hair attached to it. Police immediately launched an investigation and tracked down Peter Reyn-Bardt, who had been suspected of killing his wife, Malika de Fernandez, for the past 20 years. To his credit, Peter, who was already in prison at this point for pedophilia charges, immediately confessed to, yep, that's her. That was me. Totally did it. I didn't think people would ever find her body because this was a peat bog and stuff like just disappears in there, I thought. The two had basically entered into a marriage of convenience back in 1959, where Malika would receive cheaper airline tickets from Peter's airport job. And then Peter would have a wife, so people would stop thinking he was gay, even though he was super gay. The problem was that Peter didn't disclose the fact that he was gay to Malika, who was then horrified to walk in on him with another man one day. And I feel like if you're going to go into one of these arranged marriages, you should probably make sure both sides are on the same page. Malika's over here like, oh my gosh, I married the perfect man and I get cheap airline travel. It's amazing. And Peter's over here like, all right, I got my beard. Now I can go be gay. All I got to do is just let her fly with me for cheap sometimes. This is great. This is a great setup. I am good with it, whatever. So Malika finds out Peter's gay. She decides to blackmail him, which being gay was a crime in England in the 1960s. And when Peter discovered that Malika was about to blackmail him, Peter decided to just hack Malika's body to pieces and dump it in the Lindau Moss Bog. Police had long suspected Peter of committing the murder, but they never really had enough evidence to charge him with the crime until this point. However, when Peter's trial began, a professor from Oxford University testified that this skull fragment didn't actually belong to Malika. This professor had actually gotten a hold of this skull. He had conducted carbon-14 dating on the skull and found that it actually dated back to 250 AD during the Roman era in Britain, which makes the preservation of that skull that much more remarkable. And this was like scientifically proven, like it actually wasn't Peter's dead wife. And so Peter, he's like, oh man, he tries to revoke his confession, but the court still convicted him of the murder, even though there was still no actual evidence of Malika's body anywhere to be found. Another body was discovered in that same bog in 1987, but scientists believe it was from the same Roman era and part of a ritual sacrifice to Celtic enclave. So just, for future reference, don't try to bury a body in a moss bog. It will be very well preserved, and you will ultimately get caught with murder because you probably will confess. Like, Peter probably dumped her body in that bog, but yeah. Just jump the gun on the confession. Our final story here is of Kay Grayson, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1941. In her younger years, she lived in Florida and Las Vegas, where she worked as a dancer and a showgirl. She ultimately got married, owned a ranch outside of San Diego, and then lived on a sailboat and traveled around the Caribbean. So she's killing it in life. She's doing great. By 1990, she had settled in Terrell County, North Carolina, after being awarded 970 acres of land in a business lawsuit settlement. Kay told herself that she would only be there temporarily, but living in such an isolated area turned her into a hippie, and she never left, which is weird because Terrell County is like way eastern North Carolina, like lowlands, a lot of swampy, low-lying areas. I think the county seat of Terrell County is like a 500-person town. Like, it's very, very sparsely populated. And so for someone to move out there and become a hippie is weird, because usually the people that move out there are the same kind of people who like move to like rural Idaho or Montana, where they're like, no one's coming on my land, no one's taking my property, and I'm going to shoot everybody. Like, that's who that kind of... So she becomes a hippie, though. She also started feeding the black bears that regularly showed up on her property, which she named Bear Song, and local residents quickly began identifying her as the Bear Lady. Can you guess what's going to happen? The trailer in which she lived in had no electricity, no running water, no heat. She used an outdoor toilet and burned kerosene to heat her home and cook her meals. When hunters shot up her truck, because she regularly made a sport of shooting at hunters, she began relying on friends to drive her into town for groceries and other supplies. She sold videos of her bears and asked for donations from visitors to cover her living expenses and bear food, which I don't know how she has living expenses when she... I don't know what happened to her husband. Maybe they got divorced or something, but like, she should have money from a divorce or, her late husband's estate if he died. She should have proceeds from the sale of her ranch outside of San Diego. If she had a sailboat, I mean, maybe she spent all the money on the boat and spinning around the crib, maybe, but she could have sold the boat. I don't know. But then also she owned all this land in the settlement that she won. I don't know. I don't understand where all her money went, but whatever. In 2015, after not being seen or heard from for some time, Kay's remains were found in the woods on her property. Friends had noticed that Kay had not been looking or feeling well in recent weeks, and when police arrived on her property, they found her remains scattered along the old logging road she used to take walks on to feed her bears. Investigators were never like fully sure if a bear attacked and killed her, or maybe she just collapsed and died along the path before a bear later came along and ate her and redistributed her in various places along the property. But of course, that's what happened to her. All right, karma in the books. 5 people who got what was coming to them in a not very surprising way. Let's recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, William Burke murdered a bunch of people, sold their bodies to a doctor who was going to dissect them and study them. And then when Burke was finally arrested for all the murder, the judge ordered his body to be dissected, which is, so good. Number 2, Grace Olive Wiley handled a lot of snakes. Said snakes aren't bad. They're totally harmless. And then had an Indian cobra just bite her face off and she died. Number 3, the final number 3. Hey, listen, if you murder someone and you dump their body in a swamp somewhere, and then years later, there's a body that's discovered, like, just make sure that it's the body and not just a different body before you start confessing everything. Next week on Our Weird World, I have one story for you, and that is a story of serial killer Terry Rasmussen. I have a feeling that a lot of you have never heard of this guy before, but there is just an insane connection to a long-standing restaurant that you have probably heard of, and we're going to talk about that next week. I don't want to spoil anything for you. I don't want to give anything away. I don't want you to like try to get ahead and start searching this, because I want to tell you this story, and I really want to, I want you to experience it brand new, no context at all whatsoever. So the story of Terry Rasmussen next week. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends about the show so they can listen. That's why I say that. And keep it weird.